This is the Books Podcast presented by Tim Hague.
You have to cause some offence. She was megalomaniacal, she was arrogant. Public lesbians.
I ask you, gentlemen of the jury, is this the kind of book you'd like your wives and servants to read?
Difficult Women is one of those books that when you finish reading it, you're absolutely dying to get hold of the author and talk about it some more. I mean, a lot more in this case. So I am delighted that Helen Lewis is joining me via Skype, because these are the dark days of the COVID-19 lockdown. Helen, thank you for, coming, and thank you for the book.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me on to chat about it.
I really did enjoy it. It was an absolute page-turner, and I learned so much. As well as, going over... Hey, it's always good to say, yeah, I knew that. And, but I didn't know that. That's always good news.
Right, and I kind of thought it's been funny reading the reviews, because some of them... There was one sentence in one of them that made me laugh, which was like, some of this material will be familiar, to anybody who's read any of the several group biographies of the suffragettes in recent years. And I thought, all right, calm down. Like, how many people actually have, and that's fine. Also, I wanted to write it for, a bright 17-year-old who hasn't read any of this stuff, and be, welcome back to that, let alone, as you say, people who maybe are interested in the subject but don't feel that they've done the reading list.
Yeah. I was making notes and I wrote down, this is my kind of feminist, and then I scratched that out and don't tell her that. It's like she's supposed to care whether I like her or not. So I decided not to ask you that one.
I do, though, because it makes sense. If you're supposed to be an effective political communicator, that matters. The idea that people find you, pleasant to be with, and whether or not pleasant to be with is the right word, but they find you stimulating to be with, they agree with your ideas, all of that idea that that your personality is kind of attractive, whether or not it's in a kind of horrifying compelling way or kind of pleasantly compelling way, is really important. Yeah, but who wants to be hectored for 400 pages about something that they've paid their own good money to read, and to be told that they're a bad person?
So look, let's talk about the book, Difficult Women, A History of Feminism in 11 Fights. To some extent, it's a corrective, isn't it? At one point you say that modern feminism has a tendency to fall into two modes, empty celebration or shadow boxing with outright bastards. You've got a more grown-up approach.
Well, I hope so, but I think it's really, that bit is applicable to all types of modern politics. I think there are lots of people who want to say the right things and be seen to be doing the right things, but actually you have to cause some offence. You have to go in there. You have to mix things up. You have to say that your priority comes first above anyone else's. All of which doesn't really tend to make you popular. So I think there's I look around, particularly places like Twitter, and see people what I think of as kind of pushing on an open door, or doing some pretty furious tweets about how they're against war and against poverty and all of that kind of stuff. But you have to, for me, the interesting question is, well, hang a minute, who's causing all the bad things in life, and actually what can we do to actually get rid of them, rather than saying that we're against them? And it turns out one of those things is by being difficult. You say in the book that I think you call it woke washing, don't you? When companies say, "Oh, we have an LGBT policy," but they don't actually make any differences, and you don't have a lot of time for that. Well, no, because I don't think it's actually really making things better for the lives of LGBT people, particularly. And that should be the measure, really, of any kind of progressive action, is actually whose life is it making better? And is it making life better for the chief executive of a company that loves being on a power list, or is it making life better for the actual people at the sharp end of those discriminations? And if you are a low-paid worker in a company that's barely scraping together minimum wage with very few employment protections, it's not really particularly exciting to you that they've got a kind of corporate diversity program. So I think that is where always I would suggest the focus should be. To be honest, I'm amazed how restrained women, actually the rest of us, but women are about the glacial progress that we've made, because we have come quite a long way. Your book is about the progress we've made, but also there's quite the Equal Pay Act was 1970, and I think the Gender Pay Act is gender pay gap is still like 10%, even for full-time working people. Leave aside the part-timers who are even worse treated, and that's a part of what you want to get at as well. There's a way to go. Yeah, but I think the trouble is that it has become more complicated. So I think the thing about equal pay is there are still cases, even though legally we have the right to equal pay, where that's obviously not happening. Samira Ahmed's tribunal at the BBC made a very clear case that some people are designated as stars, and therefore everything that they do is sort of rated higher. And those people are more likely to be men. I mean, if you look at the BBC pay gap figures, they've been making progress on them, but that's kind of about a culture of who we value. But even get away from that straightforward discrimination, the arguments become harder and harder to make. Because as you say, full-time employees, that's a really interesting part of the picture, because it's not sort of some freak occurrence that happens to be that women are more likely to be in part-time work. And they are. I think 40% of women in employment are in part-time work compared with 13% of men. It's because they're the ones who are by and large taking their foot off the pedal in career terms when they want to raise a family. Those effects last well beyond the couple of years that children tend to be at home, and throughout the rest of their careers. And women are still paying in their 60s for decisions that they made in their 20s and 30s. But that's a harder argument to make because people will invoke the idea of choice. Well, you chose to have children. You chose to do this. And that's kind of all very well. But, one of the things that I've tried to make the case in the book is we should always look at the context in which choices are made.
As opposed to just, in fact, you say individual choices are all very well, but the context in which they're made is sort of more important.
Right, because that's about society, and that's the bit that you kind of need to change rather than, and feminism has been kind of guilty of this about concentrating on the individual level. And you really do see the limits of that when you talk about things like, women should be more upfront about asking for a pay rise. And that's fair enough. But we have to take into account the fact that, women who are seen as pushy at work are penalised more. They might be concentrated in industries which are fundamentally very low paid, such as care work. So there isn't money there to do that. And also that they might possibly ask and simply not get one. And there is research that I've included in the book showing that. So this idea that what's happening is that women are underpaid because they're doing the wrong jobs and they're not being aggressive enough in pursuing their careers is really tempered by the evidence that we have that suggests that's not always the full explanation.
I've sort of brought you into the discussion from the back end of it. You approach this in the book by looking back at the fights that we've already had, the 11 fights in the time, and the women who fought them. And I don't know if that was the sort of the starting point of your interest, but one of the things is that you want to get away from whitewashing the heroines of saying these are marvelous people who had no faults. Because they were complicated, flawed like everybody else, and you want to say that's okay, don't you? You want to say these women fought the battles for us, and we can celebrate that without having to turn them into icons.
Yeah, there's something kind of hysterically myopic about the idea that, we've now achieved the full, final, finished version of what society looks like. And everyone else before us was a kind of, blighted creature who, on this onward march to progress. Because I'm sure there are things that we take absolutely for granted in society now that in 50 years' time people will think are abhorrent. I always think about this. I mean, I'm a meat eater, but I do think that it's entirely possible that in 100 years' time people think that factory farming was completely, we were intelligent animals in cages in these horrible conditions. That's entirely possible. So I think you have to be slightly humble about the fact that your own behaviour might not look that brilliant to future generations, and to apply that kind of, the kind of allowance you would want people to make for you retrospectively to other people and other pioneers, and to recognise that, if you're talking about anybody pre-1900, their attitudes to class and race are going to probably be what we would now think of as unenlightened. And that doesn't mean we should excuse them or give them a pass on that. It just means it's much more interesting to understand people in the context of the time in which they lived, and what strategies they had to use in that time that may be different now. Victorian women's campaigners were obsessed with respectability. Well, wouldn't you have been? It was a time in which respectability was incredibly highly prized. And actually the arguments for things like women's education were that, this was the kind of thing that would turn out respectable, intelligent young ladies. It would have been a very stupid argument to make, to say this is step one, overthrowing the male race and marching onwards to, glorious female domination of everything, because, people would have gone, I'm not actually up for that, and reacted against it. But equally well, at the same time, those respectability arguments can really backfire on women, because you can end up in situation, I think, as with the benefit system from the now, where, welfare queens and single moms and all this kind of stuff, this rhetoric comes out that is fundamentally about the fact that women don't deserve benefits if they have lived in a way that social conservatives, don't approve of. So it's a double-edged sword, but trying to pick out when that's a tactic that's worth using, when it's counterproductive, is really interesting to me.
Yeah, you say, in fact, one of the quotes in the book is, we don't have to be perfect to deserve equal rights. And another one is that you say role models, setting up role models is a kind of, you call it inspiration porn. Can we talk about one or two of the women and how they fall short, perhaps, of our current standards, but we can still look at them and say, well, they were a step on the way. You talk about Mary Stopes and her approach to eugenics.
Yeah, I mean, Mary Stopes is an extremely flawed woman, both in political terms and in personal terms. She was megalomaniacal, she was arrogant, she was, very selfish, I guess. It was also a life marked by tragedy. She wasn't allowed to give birth to her first child in the way that she wanted, and the baby was stillborn. She eventually had her only son at the age of 43, and pretty much, smothered him.
Yes, and wouldn't let him marry the woman he wanted.
And yeah, because she was short-sighted. Well, that was her cover story for it anyway. But and other people in the birth control movement found her very difficult to work with. But the thing that interests me about eugenics is not saying eugenics is bad, which is a fairly banal and obvious statement to make from our perspective now, but asking what were the conditions that led to it being arising. And if you look at what happened in the First World War in Europe, the deaths of so many men, just such an incredible loss and waste of life, then it isn't surprising to me that actually what happened then was concerns about, whether or not, the depopulation was happening, whether or not all these women who'd moved into the factories and gained more economic independence didn't want to have, 9 children like their mothers had had. And under those circumstances, combine that with the paternalism of the age, and it's very easy to see where that kind of toxic brew that led to eugenics came from. And then obviously that then gets mixed in with concerns about racial mixing, which is not a strain particularly that Mary Stopes was involved with. She was definitely more lent towards anti-Semitism than what we would now think of as, black or Muslim forms of eugenics, which is more what's really happening in contemporary society when people talk about things like white genocide or the Muslimification of Europe. But that's what's interesting to me is rather than saying this is a purely historical phenomenon, why could someone as intelligent as Mary Stopes end up being interested in this? And actually, can we learn anything from that about why today people are still saying the same things, right? So I write about feminism and the far right sometimes, and there is a very lively strain. This mass shooter that there was in New Zealand is a subscriber to something called, the Great Replacement Theory, which is the idea that Muslim populations are growing much faster than white populations, and that Europe is kind of turning brown. And and then really the way to deal with this is anti-feminism. It's about the fact that women have become too liberated, too divorced at home. And so you can easily see where the currents are in mainstream politics that, provide a fertile petri dish for this stuff. And, some of that you can learn about from looking back to the 20s and 30s. And that's why I find history so endlessly fascinating, is it gives you a way to talk about the present with a level of detachment that maybe allows you to see your own circumstances more clearly.
Can we talk about a couple of the other ones? I found lots to interest me in the book, and lots. I mean, there were people, of course, that I was familiar with, but I became a lot more familiar. And then one or two that I should have known. Maureen Cahoon. Tell me about Maureen Cahoon. And she's almost contemporary with us. I should know who she is, and I've more or less never heard of her.
Yeah, born in the 1920s, and at the time of speaking, she's still alive. And she was the first openly gay MP. She was lesbian. So lots of people, I certainly did, casually thought that was Chris Smith from the New Labour government.
Yeah, me too.
Actually, he was the first LGB MP to come out voluntarily. Cahoon was outed by the Daily Mail after leaving her husband, who was a journalist for a campaigner called Babs Todd. And they had a housewarming party which had a picture of a cartoon of 2 women kissing on it, which found its way to Nigel Dempster, the diary columnist at the Daily Mail.
And he was a sweetheart, wasn't he?
Well, yes. I mean, the suggestion really is that one of their fellow guests was applying for a visa to America to become a teacher. And had they been outed as a lesbian, they would have been refused that on grounds of quote unquote deviancy. Which is one of those things that you think, well, that's astonishing, but that's within quite a lot of people's living memory, that you could be denied a visa to work in another country like America because you were gay. Maureen's story is a reminder really of in one lifetime how far we've come, because I think we should always, focus on that, not just on the struggles that are left, but to be appreciative of the fact that people like her put in these incredible sacrifices. I mean, she got into trouble with some comments about Enoch Powell, where she tried to make the case really that the Labour Party talked a good game on race, but didn't really listen to its base and their concerns, which is something that still gets Labour into trouble now, because it's read as being a kind of defence of far right rhetoric. But she really got she was nearly deselected, but went through a long battle, eventually managed to be reselected, but lost her seat at the 1979 election. Really, that was because she was a lesbian, and she was an out lesbian. This is the thing I find absolutely extraordinary, the courage that she required at the time to do that when there were so few public lesbians is extraordinary to me. And I think probably even LGBT people in their 30s, let alone in their 20s, it's very hard to go back in time and conjure up what even just that generation above them's experience of life was, and of being in the closet, and of that sense of constant worry about being outed, and what it would mean for your career if you were.
You see, her story is fascinating. I was really interested to read it. I was equally interested when I realised that I didn't know her, because that seems to me highly striking. I like to imagine that I'm not completely ignorant, and I should know her. Tell you one I do know, and I will do just one more of your studies, if that's all right. Erin Pizzey. Of course, I do remember Erin Pizzey when she was this champion, this fiery champion of women's rights in setting up the Chiswick Women's Refuge, which was, when did she do that? It was 60s?
1971.
71.
Yeah.
But she's had this bizarre journey to anti-feminist men's rights, the men's right activists that she's associated with. How does that happen?
Well, that was the whole question that I wanted to answer in that chapter. And I too find her story absolutely fascinating. And I found meeting her really fascinating as well, because she wasn't rude to me at all, and she wasn't guarded about being interviewed. She was actually very open and very, very honest with me. She just allows a level of latitude for anti-women rhetoric from men's rights activists that she would find was hysterical and anti-men among feminists, and I think that's a really interesting story about political polarization, right? About the fact that we're all much readier to let our own side off the hook than whereas we're very easy to see the mote in the eye of our opponents. But also the fact is, I think it's about whether or not you're a feminist. And I think I agree with Julie Bindel, the activist, who said, I don't think Erin Pizzey was ever a feminist. She didn't buy the idea of something called patriarchy, or have an analysis of male violence that is now the feminist one. She was somebody who saw something terrible happening and was brave enough and strong enough and determined enough to go and do something about it. And that's what's extraordinary about her, is, it's really, again, it's one of those things that's really hard to remember now, when there are, Refuge and Women's Aid are absolutely mainstream organisations, but there weren't domestic violence shelters. The words domestic violence weren't really commonly used. It was wife beating, and it was seen as being a kind of perk of marriage.
It does. That phrase does it, doesn't it?
Or it was something that you did if you were being nagged, or it was about being provoked into it. And men would frequently get off murder charges if they killed their wife, because of what we now call them nagging and shagging defence. If their wife had cheated on them, or if she was deemed to have nagged them, then this was seen as being who wouldn't in those circumstances? It was sort of kind of it was seen as a management responsibility. And there were debates in Parliament. I write about the first domestic abuse bill debate in Parliament, where people say things that they still say now, like, the trouble is that women don't report it. And Jack Ashley, the MP who was promoting the bill, said, well, no, I've got lots of testimony from women that they do go and report it, and it just isn't taken seriously. And the police still have problems now with prosecuting domestic violence, not least because it's often, both sides will say the other started it, or women are very reluctant to testify because they're in a coercive relationship where, someone swings between affection to them and violence towards them, and, cuts off all their means of support. And I wanted to deal with some of the difficulty of that, because it is really, really hard. There are such a thing as dysfunctional relationships in which both sides contribute to it. And saying that is not to excuse the people who go on to then kill their partner in those relationships, but it does suggest that we are fundamentally failing to tackle a whole culture around this stuff.
So can we say then that Erin Pizzey was good at dealing with a problem on the ground, but not so good at the big picture, maybe. And if so, do we have a working definition of feminism? I mean, can I press you, or is that going to be just a terribly underhand approach?
No, I mean, I go with Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's one. Feminist is someone who believes in the social, political, and economic equality of the sexes. And you can unpack that and to various degrees. And I think a lot of the things that I've written about in the book, particularly about legal reforms. And equality under the law, which is, I think, a particular type of argument to make, and not an easy argument to make, but at least to most people it makes sense. The harder arguments to make are maybe the policy and economics-based ones, which are about often the fact that men and women are different and they live different lives. And I'm really talking about biology and reproduction here, that actually, if we say, there's no pay gap being a very good example, right? Between full-time workers in their 20s, there's no difference between men and women. And what that suggests is the fact that, well, women can work like men. They can do the late nights. They can do the, changing plans at the last minute. They can, they can move to another city if they need to for work. Then they're able to compete on entirely equal terms and be rewarded on equal terms. So that kind of overt, girls can't do this job is receding slightly. But unfortunately, you can't make those gender neutral policies when you get a bit later on in life and only one half of the workforce is growing other humans inside them and then feeding other humans from their own bodies, because that's a fundamental divide. And treating them the same means penalizing women for not, for having babies, basically.
Yes, of
and
course.
That's a harder argument to make, I think.
So there, in fact, are women's issues that are specific and that need to be addressed in order to create a level playing field.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's one of the things that modern feminism is quite uneasy with, because it feels like it's sort of reducing women to biology, or implying that biology is destiny, to even mention it. And of course, that's not true. We have this really great thing about, the social model of disability, right? Which is, the problem isn't disability necessarily. It's about a society that's built, for people without that disability. So a society that assumes that everyone can get upstairs, assumes that everyone can hear, all that kind of stuff. And the same thing is true about, a social model built around the idea that everybody lives one particular type of life, is exactly the problem. The problem isn't the fact that people are having children. They've been doing that for some time now, and I suspect it might carry on into the future. The problem is not taking that into account when you design structures and government policies.
We've talked about it and found it very easy to agree about things, but there are quite serious controversies, aren't there, that we could investigate. For instance, this business of they call them TERFs, don't they? Trans-exclusionary radical feminists, where the status of some of the excluded minorities is in conflict with perhaps with others. Where do you stand on that? Because it's bound to be a row within feminism.
Well, for a start, I wouldn't personally ever use the word TERF, because I think it's deliberately insulting, and also it doesn't really accurately, to me, describe what's going on, which is, I don't know that many people, I think, who would say that trans women should be excluded from feminism. I think there are more people making the argument that there are some contexts in which people born male should be treated differently from people born female. And that's not an absurd suggestion to...
It's not, but it is controversial, isn't it? I mean, I know young people who would pillory us for saying anything of that sort.
Right, and with the best will in the world, I suspect it's much easier to say that at 20, when, as you say, you're working, full time. You're able to go to university the same as your male peers. Your life is, as a woman, is very much like that of your male peers. It's a harder thing to maintain when you're 40 and your pelvic floor's gone, and and you're seeing mediocre men at work overtake you because you've had a couple of years out of the workforce, or you've had a miscarriage and had to deal with that, or needed to have an abortion and deal with that. There are things that accumulate because you have a female body. And, look, as you say, it's an incredibly heated subject. And even talking about it is a huge, I say risk, but it brings a lot of heat on you. But my position on it has always been really simple, which is that woman is a legal and social category as well as a biological one. And I think it's perfectly possible for people to transition into it and be treated by and large as women, even if they weren't born female. That said, feminism has to talk about the female body and what that does, because so many of its issues arise from reproduction. You have to go back to Engels talking about the fact that patriarchy comes from control of female reproduction as a kind of resource like labor. And And there are things that going through male puberty gives you. By and large, you are bigger, stronger. And you have a hormonal environment that is just different. So when it comes to sports, for example, if you want to create a level playing field, that's a really difficult question. And the answer is not just to go, why are some women complaining about this? They should just budge up. Because that's the kind of thing that I find people are very keen to give away, other people's rights, and female participation in sports has always been and still is a really difficult issue, and the answer just to saying, well, there's no conflict at all just seems very appealing, but is the wrong one. Instead, you have to work through it, deferentially to everybody's feelings and individual dignity, but you can't necessarily wave your hand and make it go away. And again, that's difficulty, right? That's what I write about in the book. And it's just that the modern left has sort of fallen out of love with that and wants everything to be very simple and wants there to be good people and bad people, I think.
And as you say, outrage has become prized for its own sake. It's very easy to just be strident and narrow and about things and not admit of the controversies. Here's another controversy. And I'm going to go a bit devil's advocate. You'll have to forgive me here. Feminism is and always has been in conflict with other programs, other needs for progress. And isn't it possible that decent people who accept your analysis might still think that feminism is not necessarily the highest priority? Extinction Rebellion probably would say, no, I'm sorry, the global warming is more important. And anti-racists or, I don't know, radical socialists or enthusiasts for a donkey sanctuary or whatever, whoever it is, might say, that's all very well. Yes, we should have, the progress of feminism, but this issue is even more important. And how do we address that?
Oh, people say that all the time. I wouldn't worry about feeling...
And always have. You say in your book, they always have.
Yeah, and I think a lot about that great... I'm pretty sure it's Nye Bevan quote, the language of priorities is the religion of socialism. And I think that's the truth if you're a part of any kind of political movement. You have to ask what you really want and which one do you want to ask for first and what are you prepared to sacrifice in order to get it. It's a bit like, Tony Benn's 5 questions for power. What do you want most? Who can give it to you? Who is stopping you from getting it? And how much are you willing to compromise or sacrifice in order to obtain it? And those things are never resolved, and you can't really make universal principles around them. There may be some, I see a lot of op-eds and I just think, I don't care. I put this in the book, I just don't really care about armpit hair one way or the other. Yeah. It's, I agree it's weird that we decided that half of the population had to shave their armpits and the half didn't. But I'm not going to waste particularly a vast amount of time on it. But equally well, if there are other people who feel really strongly about it, that's fine. That's, it's my job to convince them to come and join me rather than, attack them. And I think that's true of anything else. I think if you're going to make the case, the environmental policy should come above everything else, then that's a perfectly legitimate argument to make. I don't have to agree with you, and it's your job to convince me.
Is solidarity the big counter in this?
It's an interesting question because I think solidarity is very difficult in application because there's a case of sometimes just letting other people get on with their own thing and not sabotaging them. And there's definitely a kind of there's definitely a phenomenon of attracting attention to your own cause by slagging off someone else's. And to do that, it's much easier to do that if you create a straw man or straw woman in this case, right? So I read a lot of pieces about how terrible feminism is because it's only interested in CEOs. And you think, is it? Be more constructive with your feedback. Who are you actually talking about here? And it's not a massive surprise to me that female CEOs have summits with other female CEOs talking about how to be a CEO. That seems to be something that we should probably expect. And actually making those kind of incredibly generalized criticisms just is really mostly about positioning yourself as the one true feminist in my view. But there's, equally well, I do take the idea that, there is a specific thing that I would call kind of corporate feminism, which is about this whole industry of sort of diversity panels and, benchmarks and kite marks and slightly sort of synthetic talking shop type stuff. And I don't particularly feel any solidarity with that. But equally well, I only want to criticize it to the extent that I feel it's probably taking time and effort away from more useful and constructive things.
Well, We could talk about another hour on this, but we're not going to. That's about how much time we've got. Helen, I really enjoyed the book. We haven't sort of explained how funny it is and how. I
was going to say, I think I've probably made the book sound like a terrifically tedious policy document by talking about the benefit system. But
it's so much isn't. It's so much isn't.
Cheap gags about all kinds of stuff in there.
Oh, it's funny. It's fantastically readable, and it's full of stories. It's full of people's stories and stories of how the progress was made, which is a real page turner. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for having me. As I say, that is exactly the thing I like most about it, is finding out how weird people were and how weird people still are. You know, when you start writing about people's actual lives, there are things in them that you just think that's just completely extraordinary, the sort of coincidences that pile up or the kind of weird facts that you find out along the way. And so it's a very strangely written book in the sense of it's not really a group biography. It's divided into these 11 fights, but I can promise anybody who wants to read it, you will meet some absolutely extraordinary cast of characters, and it won't just be me banging on about the pay gap.
I thought the structure was extremely cunning, very effective.
Good.
We've been talking about Difficult Women, A History of Feminism in 11 Fights by Helen Lewis, which is published by Jonathan Cape at £16.99. Helen, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
That was Books Podcast, presented by Tim Haig. Books Podcast is a Green Shoot production. You can find out more at www.green-shoot.com, and Tim can be contacted on tim@green-shoot.com.